about that a little bit today.
So over to you.
All right, thanks. So I'm Joe. I'm down from Portland. Up there I work at a company called Galois. Galois is named after the French mathematician. It's not Gaulois like the cigarette. It's Galois like Évariste Galois. And Galois has been around for 20 years, and we do basically R&D for national security. Galois gives birth to a new company about every year, commercializing work that we've mainly done for the government. And the most recent company one of the most recent companies that it's given birth to is called Free and Fair, and I run Free and Fair. And Free and Fair focuses on helping make democracies more trustworthy. So today I'm going to talk about nationally critical infrastructure needs secure hardware. I come at this from the perspective of first as an old academic. I used to be a professor of computer science in Europe for many years, including in the Netherlands, in Nijmegen. And in that role, I was often asked to advise governments about matters of information security and cybersecurity, particularly in countries like the Netherlands or in Denmark, where you have things like nationalized healthcare and integrated e-government services, and the government would give you something like a smart card to access your services. And so if you're an information security professional and you're a public employee, you often get called up by ministers and they ask you to look into things. And then when I came back to the USA about 6 years ago and joined Galois, I began to work more for our government here in the USA. And in particular, I work a lot for the intelligence community and for the Department of Defense. And so nothing I'm saying today is fishy or secret or anything like this. In fact, I'm not going to touch upon anything that gets even close to that, but I will tell some stories that relate upon that. And fundamentally what this is about is me sort of as an academic, I always thought that folks in government and folks building big, very, very expensive military systems and things that go into space and all that would be doing a really good job, and their systems would be really secure. And what I've found is that's very not true. It is remarkable how we can spend enormous amounts of money, and defense contractors, whom I really don't like working with too much, can build massive military systems, which we don't work on. We don't like any of that stuff. We do only defensive work. Can spend an enormous amount of money building a system and then never pay attention to cybersecurity aspects of it. Like, it's quite remarkable. You know, we have folks in the field and things that fly and things that move, and they have computers all over them, and yet their attack surfaces are gigantic, and there's not a cryptographer on staff. So some of this talk is reflections upon that and how it connects to matters of hardware security in particular. So first I'll start with a backstory, which is about cybersecurity of nationally critical infrastructure that I've worked on in the past, or that colleagues of mine have worked on at Galois. And the idea here is that we have assurance cases of these systems. That is to say, you're giving evidence that the system is correct and secure. And unfortunately, those assurance cases are more like assurance castles that are built on sand. Sand here is not just a metaphor for sand castle, which I'll show a picture of, but also riffs on matters of silicon. So if we look at a typical application stack, it has an app, it has some software, there's some firmware in there, there's some hardware in there, and you ask yourself, where's the security? Right? Every day, like just today in the news, in my Twitter feed, there's 2 massive new security things going on. And you look at it and you say, gosh, you know, where are things going wrong? Why are we playing whack-a-mole with security vulnerabilities all the time? And the problem here is that, let me show it to you by virtue of a case study. Here's a case study. This is a gate leaving a building that I visited that happens to be somewhere in the northeast United States. And as you can see, it's meant to have people move through that gate and check out and check into the installation. But of course, people have just, you know, when it snows, you can see that people just drive through the field. It's an example of a security idea that was put in place with a certain framing. And of course, everyone around that system, whether adversarial or not, finds ways to bypass the security. This is a physical metaphor for something called a reference monitor, which is a kind of digital security system that used in the military to sort of keep secrets secret. Okay? So a good reference monitor is not this, right? It's not the kind of thing that you can drive around. In fact, it's something that's non-bypassable. So if you don't have the right authentication, you shouldn't be able to get the wrong data. You can actually make sure that it behaves properly, so it's evaluatable. It's always invoked. That is to say, it always provides a barrier between you and the data you're interested in, and it can't be tampered with. Now, one of the case studies I did in this, or my colleagues did in this, is to build one of these kinds of systems for the intelligence community. This is called the Galois Trusted Services Engine. This is maybe 12 years ago or so. This is a high assurance Mills system that's going to basically permit you to have top secret data and normal data on the same device. That's the key idea. You see people carry around two phones, a phone for business and a phone for pleasure, so to speak. More and more, especially in government settings, when you have people dealing with matters of secrets, they don't like carrying around their 2, 3, and 4 devices. They would like to have one device that they can do all their stuff on, all their magic stuff on, and the secrets stay secret and everything else is okay. So that's what this is meant to build. But every time they have one of these built, it's basically a bunch of guys, in a military industrial defense contractor get together and write some undocumented C code, and it doesn't work. And so they hired us to do it right. Now, the means by which you do it right in this setting is quite out there. It's the kind of thing we normally do at Galois, but most of the world doesn't do, which involves things like writing a high-level model of the system in mathematics, in logic, in higher-order logic, talking about the system's behavioral aspects, how does it operate, talking about its security properties, and reasoning about that particular model. And then you refine that and turn it into a more precise model that gets lower and lower down towards something that you could implement, and you do mathematics to prove that every time you add more details about the system, you never break your original claims that you've made about the system, in particular security claims. But then in the end, you write some code to implement the thing, and back in those days, the code would be very small, and you'd stare at the code, and you'd stare at the mathematics, and you'd say, those look the same. Now that was dissatisfactory. And in fact, this gap, this human review gap, is what has subsequently funded over 10 years of work at Galois in being able to do this automatically. So we have tools that are available, some of which are open source that you can download right now, that lets you, for example, consume C code and reason about its correctness with regards to mathematical models or other pieces of C code. We use that regularly on crypto and all kinds of other stuff. But the problem with this process, at least in the framing of software universe, even when you do something this complicated, is that if you just test the system in the end, then your worry is, have you tested enough? And if you do all this math, you're worried about, does the math accurately reflect the world? So this is like best in the world, circa 12 years ago, and yet we still have concerns about it. But a fundamental concern about it is the fact that this code runs on a CPU. And we have to make assumptions about what that CPU does in order to have any claims about how the code behaves. All of us, whenever I look at a random piece of C code on GitHub, I often kind of throw up a little bit in my mouth because, C is bad enough to start with. And then people think they understand C and all its undefined behaviors. And then you're running it on a CPU that you don't even trust. So let's see where we can go from here. The code has to run, in general, in most settings, on an OS. So what kinds of OS can we trust? I'm building up my stack of assurance here. I'm showing you all the assumptions we have to make, even on the ultra high end, building systems for certain pieces in government where secrets really matter, for example. Well, you have all kinds of OSs out there. Monolithic, crappy OSs like we mostly live with today live on the left side of the chart, wherein if you start with your application and you're eventually doing something down here to compute in your application about secrets and stuff is flying over a network, basically you're going through millions and millions of lines of code that nobody understands and nobody trusts. In a secure domain system, where you're going to deal with an OS that you understand a lot better, you get a nice, clean architecture. You don't have this kind of craziness. It's a much smaller system. It doesn't have to run on all kinds of crazy devices in the universe. And you end up with something that's much more reasonable. This is called a Mills-based approach to operating systems. So, you got crappy stuff we use all the time, stuff that you could build for really secret cases, and a whole bunch of operating systems out there in the world that sort of give you different levels of assurance with different amounts of effort, right? So like Linux, or even SE Linux, is down here in the lower left-hand corner. It's sort of better than Linux, but only barely. Gives you some extra access control. And then you go up through these stairs of stuff that most people have never heard of, like Green Hills and Wind River and Lynx, where you get operating systems that give you greater and greater assurance about the world, but in some sense they're less and less capable of doing anything. In the upper right-hand corner are things like SEL4. So even if I crawl all the way up here, and I have a formally designed and formally assured operating system, the formal assurance that operating system gives me is basically things like virtual memory works correctly, and I guarantee I never will crash. It doesn't actually say, I'm an operating system. It says, I don't crash. That's the best we can do in this setting. So now I've built an application using all these fancy techniques that's meant to keep secrets. I run it on an operating system that's the best we can do in the world, and all it can do is say, I don't crash. And then I'm running it on hardware. So where is the hardware we can trust? Where do we build all this on top of something that executes? Because system assurance of that whole stack is about the assurance we have of the hardware and the firmware and the software. And I gotta say, as I've moved back into hardware over the past 6 years and learned more and more about modern hardware, because I got out of it for 20 years, it's a miracle anything works once you dig into it from this point of view. So what we find is, if you look at the stack of hardware that's out there, macro scale and micro scale, and the operating systems and applications we use every day, I find it's a miracle that it works, and in particular, when it comes to having any assurance about the system. In other words, me being able to say, I guarantee that the secret data that this general has on his phone will remain secret forever. I guarantee, my firstborn child. I can't say that. I mean, I like my firstborn child and all that. I love her. But I can't say that, and it's not because I didn't do a good job with the software and the firmware. It's because the hardware doesn't make any promises at all to me. If you look at a typical hardware vendor spec sheet, it says something like, it sort of does about like this, we think, at one point in time in the past. And you look at firmware spec sheets, if you can ever get them, and it basically says, you will never learn anything about this firmware, even if you licensed it and pay them a giant pile of money. And then, of course, software vendors say as is. So I'm trying to build systems for really important clients that are really worried about losing money or lives. And this is what I had to work with, even in my setting. It drives me crazy. I would use the F word right now, but someone's live streaming me. So basically, system assurance is about the assurance of all that stack. And it's all faith-based right now. We're so hosed. Like Spectre and Meltdown, you're going to get new side channels every 10 days for the next 10 years. It is just a thing. It is just awful. So I gave a talk like this and, concluded with assurance cases dependent on evidence. And right now the evidence is we suck, right? The software's terrible, the firmware's terrible, and the hardware doesn't make any promises. Even when we're doing all these high-end techniques, we can build beautiful artifices that run and do as they promise and are based on math, blah, 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 blah. But then I run it on a gray market CPU that nobody understands how it operates. So our assurance cases really are built on sand in this setting. Now the government and even private industry has cared about this for a number of years. But for about 15 years, the government has not funded hardly any considerable R&D in hardware, and in particular in hardware security. There was a huge burst of funding back in the mid-80s to the early 90s when the USA thought they were going to get their asses kicked by Japan. And then basically we got out of the game. Intel was doing their thing and turning their crank, and Moore's Law was working for everybody, and nobody wanted to pay for security in the future, so we build faster and faster processors, occasionally throwing in some new CPUs and new hearts, and we get what we have today, which makes me sad. So, a reason behind this, a reason that things are so bad today, is that we have this broken bridges between worlds. I mean, for one, as mentioned earlier today, software engineers think in terms of software, and hardware engineers think in terms of hardware, and neither of them learn from each other and talk to each other, even though they're doing the same kinds of things. That's element one. And element two is, as you design a new piece of hardware, companies like Intel will publish these 2 volumes of 1,100 pages to describe the x86 system, but it's in bad English, it's not even self-consistent, and nobody can reason about it. So some poor graduate student will be put on translating this 2,000 pages into mathematics so that someone can write a tool to reason about code on these architectures. That literally happens. This is one of these several theses on that particular topic. So this is awful. So the proposed solution about 5 years ago from some of us in the community was, let's not do it this way anymore. Let's not write descriptions of processors in English and in Word documents that have 4,000 requirements and build our CPUs out of a bunch of IP we threw together where the original designer is no longer around and nobody understands it, so please don't touch it. Instead, let's start afresh. Let's write down what our CPUs are meaning to do precisely to begin with, and then let's build a new generation of design automation tools that understands the math and understands security, and then turn the crank on a new generation of secure hardware. So let's stop doing that and let's do something more intelligent. We'll have a formal model that describes the particular processor that we're interested in this case the IA32. And we'll have a description of its behavior and of the claims you make around its security. And then you can augment existing tooling so that in building a new chip, you're not faced with hardware design. I'm going to say things that are cheeky. Hardware design these days, for me, the means by which they do what they call verification of CPUs these days, tastes a lot like what we did in open source software testing in about 93. It's quite remarkable when you go in and you see how hardware engineers puff out their chests and say, I do formal verification of my processor. And then you go and you look and they're doing shitty unit testing. It's just awful. So the proposal is, let's augment this set of tools, which are quite fine and help you build things that are quite marvelous, new processors, but actually generate evidence that the processor is in fact what you think it is and has security. So the implications of this would be, we'd have a lot of decrease in waste and all this effort of translating English into something more formal and people trying to reverse engineer and understand how processors work and find hidden ROMs and everything else. We'd have a more intelligent, cost-effective co-design method so that you could actually have assurance with your thing as you build it. And maybe if you made claims about the quality of your product that was measurable, you could open up new markets. And so even these EDA tool vendors, who sell these tools, whose licenses go for hundreds of thousands of dollars per seat per year, would be able to literally sell new versions. And, with proofs, we guarantee it, and be able to upsell. So we gave talks about this to places in government and the like, and most people in the room said we were crazy. There were F words thrown around. It was a dumbass idea. Nobody would ever do it. But certain people listened. And some miracles happened. So I'm going to tell you about those miracles next. So this was a 2014 call to action. Let's do it this way. Let's get some more intelligence into how we build systems. And so what happened is a program was created inside of DARPA, which is the advanced research side of the DoD, called SSITH. It's called SSITH. You notice I pronounce it SSITH with an extra S. because the program manager is a Star Wars geek. SSITH stands for System Security Integrated Through Hardware. He and others around him listened to those of us causing a fuss and said, maybe they have something to it. Because if you're going to be able to build, as we can today, we can build formally assured software. We can build formally assured hardware. When I mean formally assured, I mean I will bet $1 million that the thing I just designed and built for you does exactly what I promised, no more, no less, and doesn't have the following security flaws. We can do that. We have good people, good tooling. Not many people can do it, but we can do it. Let's turn our attention to hardware in the same way. And so that's what SSITH is about. So let me tell you what SSITH is about and how that changes the world with regards to secure hardware. SSITH is basically secure hardware for the win. That's the core idea here. The goal is to recognize the fact that software is always going to suck. If software is always going to suck, we have to presume that it's chock full of vulnerabilities. You pick an average 1,000-line program, it will have 50 vulnerabilities-ish. So let's just assume that. How do we fix that? How do we build a system that can actually have greater assurance even in the presence of crappy hardware? Well, the only way to do, crappy software. The only way to do that is to go down to the hardware and build mechanisms in the hardware that can deal with the suck. And that's what SSITH is. So the idea is pick a bunch of vulnerability classes that we all make money off of but we're miserable about, and challenge people who do hardware design and security to work together to build a new generation of CPUs that will make those vulnerabilities disappear. And do it all open source, open hardware. So SSITH focuses on doing that. It focuses on, in particular, doing this on top of RISC-V, which I'll tell you a little bit about, the new kind of RISC that's open. And it's demonstrating all these CPUs on high-end FPGAs. So these are all soft cores in this program. We're not yet fabbing any CPUs. There are now 6 teams that have been working on this for 1.5 years, and they're developing a total of 18 CPUs. Essentially, each team takes a baseline CPU, which is either a microcontroller, what's akin to a desktop processor, and a server class processor, which happen to be developed by my team. And they augment them with their special magic pixie dust security, each of which is using a very different technique. And we have to assess whether or not these secure CPUs are actually secure. So again, it's one 32-bit microcontroller and then 2 64-bit CPUs. One 5-stage in-order CPU and one 5 or 6-stage out-of-order CPU. The security approaches being used here are all over the map, and many of them you would think are crazy town. Like all the CPUs have tagging. Tagging basically means you can associate with every word of memory metadata, which is understandable by the hardware, programmable in the hardware, and lets you make decisions about access to and interpretation of that memory throughout the entire microarchitecture. So for example, if a piece of memory is tagged that it's owned by a certain process or a certain thread, it can only be accessed in the following way. As that data read from the memory flows through fetch and decode and cache, the tag goes with it. So this weaves through your entire microarchitecture, these access control rules and policies. We have new generations of enclaves. How do you build a hardware enclave that leverages firmware such that you can publish the entire design of the enclave and yet it still works? And I mean that way beyond anything we see out of somebody like ARM or SGX. Insecure. And then there's all kinds of crazy AI, which I'm not fans of, but there's a thing, and there's novel crypto. For example, one team has decided to weave into the CPU lightweight crypto everywhere. When I say everywhere, I mean, for example, your instruction set in coding is encrypted. And on the fly, every 10 milliseconds, you change your keys. And I said everywhere, so that's not just there, like your entire virtual memory map is re-encoded every 10 milliseconds. The data you hold in RAM is encrypted as well. So it's just like, it's like this cryptographic sledgehammer slammed all over the microarchitecture. And you think, God, that'll never work. How are you going to debug that? And yet they have it running. It's a frickin' miracle. So that's SSITH in a nutshell, right? Now that sounds cool. And here's the impact, right? So these SSITH CPUs have to be backwards compatible. Literally, we run Linux on them. And if you've got an existing binary that has a vulnerability in it, and you've configured the CPU to deal with that particular vulnerability, then as soon as you run that code on this particular CPU, that entire vulnerability class disappears. Now, if a vulnerability in that particular code is attempt to be leveraged on this CPU, each of the CPUs behaves in a different way. Some of them, trap and respond. Some of them do mitigation. There's all kinds of different techniques teams are using. But in the main, it means that if you do a buffer overflow, it should never cause harm. That's the very first set of vulnerability classes they tackle. And in particular, they're focusing on 7 different vulnerability classes over the span of the around 4-year program. The first 2 that they've tackled that we'll be demonstrating this year is all forms of memory errors and buffer errors should go away, and all forms of digital and timing information leakage. So no more timing attacks, period. Questions are always welcome, or you can throw things at me. Yes, sir, in the back. These are being demonstrated on a Xilinx VCU 118. It's a mid-range FPGA that has no ARM processor on it so that we can do full custom hardware on everything. We have IP blocks added to the CPU so that it can do things like serial and Ethernet and a bit more. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. The main problem with the VCU 118 is it comes from Xilinx. 1 is a problem. And I just think, some products aren't very good. And 2, it's around $9,000 a pop, which is not very democratic. Like if we all want to play with it, right? I mean, you want a nice, cool, secure RISC-V on your desk at home to play with. Well, $9,000 later, you can have one. I don't think that's very cool. So we have a solution for that. But that's what we're using at the moment. I think I have pictures of them a little bit later. Now, the security-related R&D that's going on in this frame is vast. It's not just the little topics I mentioned before, but some really weird techniques are being used. So, for example, one of the teams is at MIT, another team is SRI and Cambridge working together. Those 2 teams, plus us, plus folks like Symbiotic, are doing formal specifications of the entire core. And because we're using RISC-V, we're able to write a description of all of this RISC instruction set and prove that the entire CPU does exactly those instructions, no more and no less. It's the kind of thing that we've never been able to do before because of the complexity of the instruction sets and history of entities like Intel and ARM. Indeed, each of those companies has done formal verification of little pieces of their systems, right? I mean, Intel got into formal verification because they got bit by a floating point bug when I was younger and some of you were kids. But, the techniques that we're seeing here are crazy. Like some of the stuff that's going on in this area is, people are adding crypto to these chips and working with us, and instead of handwriting the crypto, instead they take a mathematical model of the crypto and we generate the implementation automatically. And the implementation we generate automatically is formally verified. So this is a level up. Yes, sir? Are
you accounting for the power budgets of these things? Because I'm already seeing IoT.
Yes.
I feel like you're on your way to like half the power generated.
So it's an excellent point.
You're just going to be doing encryption and deep encryption of information.
It's an excellent point. And in fact, my Galois' role in the program originally, so I thought originally I was going to be working with friends making a new secure CPU. I've done that a little bit in the past. I thought this was going to be a great opportunity to do more. But then DARPA came to me and said, we don't want you to do that. We need someone to do all the fancy formal methods so that we can have some assurance around these 18 chips. And so they had me do something different. The thing that they've had me do different is I have to build, or we have built, a new generation of EDA tools that helps you take a design for a CPU, automatically figure out all the different products you could derive from that design, so which kind of chips could come out of that parameterized design, and evaluate them all for power, performance, area, and security. And then give designers tools so they could choose which decisions to make in design to get to the right outcome. Because DARPA said, I want higher security, but I want no impact on performance. I want no impact on power, but I'm happy to give you lots of area, right? But, if you work at Intel, it's going to be a different equation. So the tooling we've built helps you stipulate your own equation and make that trade-off. Like maybe you don't want security like the DoD, maybe you want security like Apple. Where are you going to pay for it? Because you're going to pay for it somewhere. It's an excellent point. The DoD is happy to pay for it in area, but other companies will pay for it other ways. So in any case, there's lots of interesting stuff going on in these security-related R&D in this space. Like, for example, we've built a secure boot for RISC-V that's formally assured. So we've proven the correctness of our hardware security module and the firmware that's used to do the measured boot. And these SITH teams are creating all kinds of different SOCs that have different security features. And then there's other programs funded by DARPA that complement this one. Because even if you design a new super secure CPU, well, then you go and fab it in Taiwan. And you can't trust anybody in that supply chain. So how do you deal with that? And so I work on a little bit of that. I'll mention that in a minute. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on here. Like MIT's stuff is really cool. That thing I mentioned earlier where we used fancy logic to describe the behavior of that one particular application and then did all that hard work to develop some C code? They've formally specified in that same higher order logic the entirety of the RISC instruction set, the entirety of Verilog, and they've built an automatic synthesizer that can compile a CPU. So it takes math describing a CPU and creates a CPU with formal assurance. That runs. It's crazy town. Smart people. Awesome, smart people. So, one of the programs we have worked on that I'll mention a little bit later is SHIELD. It's one of the programs that's funding secure hardware development in the DoD. SHIELD is about how do we mitigate adversaries in our supply chain. So if you're going to fab a chip and you really, really care that the thing you get back is the thing that you sent, how do you deal with that? The idea of SHIELD is to create the world's smallest integrated circuit. And it has been done. This is a picture of it. So that's a penny. That's Lincoln on the back of the penny. That's a SHIELD dielet in Lincoln's head. It is small, as you can see. And what it does for you, the idea is you want to embed these in your manufacturing process. So you put those in your mask and perhaps in your package. And inside of there is an antenna. So you can think of it as the world's smallest RFID card that can blow itself. You can interact with it through RF, but it has to be very, very close because it's a very small antenna. It can perform crypto that you would expect. That's the part my company worked on. And it has baked into it mitigations for adversarial observation. So for example, if you stick it under an electron microscope, it knows it and it blows itself. If you stick it under a laser, it knows it and it blows itself. If you vibrate it, like we talked about grinding earlier, it detects it and it blows itself. Either blows itself or logs that information. So that's the idea behind SHIELD. And they're asking me to use SHIELD in some novel ways these days. So that's the kind of crazy stuff that's going on with secure hardware in the DoD. Now, let's do it a little aside. I've mentioned RISC-V. How many of you have played with RISC-V so far? I want to advocate for it a little bit. All right, so there's 3 or 4 hands in the room. So the idea here is that we care about hardware security here, and some of the hardware security we do is things like, attacking things. The better you are at attacking things and breaking things, whether it's via software or via hardware attacks like glitch or power or like, the more you learn about that, the more you learn about how to build things right? I like doing both. And so I like to advocate that RISC-V is a great platform for building things that could be secure based upon what we learn as adversaries with whatever color hat we're wearing. A little backgrounder here. So RISC-V, it's not RISC-V, is the 5th version of RISC. It mainly comes out of Berkeley. And the idea is learn all the lessons of the past with regards to microprocessor design, not just RISC-line, but others as well, and design a new generation of microprocessor that is high quality, license-free, and royalty-free so that anyone in the world can use it and make it for free. ARM is nervous, shall we say. And it's the design of the ISA is parameterized so that you can use it sort of in small versions or large versions, and it's composable. So you can actually pick different parts of the instruction set you want and compose them all into the one that you need. So it's being used for everything from low power and energy microcontrollers up to multi-core AI things. It started in summer 2010. The early workshops were basically a bunch of graduate students that got together at either MIT or Berkeley. And the latest RISC-V summit, well, actually, it's not the latest one because there was a RISC-V event in Zurich this week, but the latest big RISC-V summit had over 1,000 people and 200 companies. That's how much it's exploded. So, and a number of large firms have announced that they've moved to RISC-V. For example, Western Digital is moving all their devices to RISC-V. NVIDIA is moving their entire line to RISC-V for their embedded controller. So it lets anybody in the world basically do open hardware R&D, and in particular, secure hardware R&D. It's really cool and interesting also if you're like a computer architecture geek or a computer scientist because it's simple, it's clean slate design, every design decision is documented, why they did it the way they did it. It's modular, as I mentioned before, and designed for extensions, so you can design your own extensions to the instruction set in a way that plays well with others. And it's nice and stable. There's a foundation behind it that ratifies standards and the like. And we have formal specifications for the entire ISA. In fact, we have several of them. And so there's a bunch of folks working on this, and you're welcome to get in touch with me if you want to learn more. There's a security standing committee that sort of sits over all the security work in the RISC-V universe, and I'm involved there. And then there's a couple of very active task groups right now to doing cryptographic extensions, where my colleague Dan Zimmerman is involved, and a whole trusted execution environment. So how do you build from scratch a clean enclave that actually works and works for the world? And NVIDIA is pushing that because they use that enclave inside of their GPUs. You know why there's an enclave in a GPU? I didn't know this until I heard from Joe. GPUs use a lot of power, and they get hot, and they have those big-ass fans on them. What happens if you put malware on a GPU? And you're able to, say, push it hard. And did you know you can make a desktop machine burst into flames from a GPU? So, no comment. So it's a thing. Yeah, it's not just Teslas that blow up if you know what you're doing on security hacking. And if you want to know more about that, you can Google me. So that's my aside on RISC-V. So I encourage you to look into RISC-V if you want to do constructive work in the world of open hardware. Now let's turn our attention now to the last part of my talk. And it is this subtext, democracy is a critical system. So there was a little leak of information earlier about that topic. And I want to tell you a little bit about this and how it connects to what I just talked about. So one of the things I've done for the past 19 and a half years is elections. I got involved with elections because I grew up in Florida. I am Florida man. I went to high school there, and I went to college at Florida State. Yeah, Seminoles. And the 2000 election happened. I wasn't in Florida at the time. I was in California. But, that was Gore v. Bush. It all came down to one county in Florida, and then the Supreme Court deciding that we don't get to do a recount. And that just pissed me off, because I'm a West Coaster now. And I thought, wow, computers could be really useful in elections. This is in 2000. And I looked into it, and I found, yes, that's true, but it's hard. And in particular, elections in democracy have all these interesting requirements that conflict with each other. About you have to be able to vote, and you have to be able to identify who you are, maybe with voter ID or not. But then your ballot has to be delinked from you. and you can't prove to anyone in the world how you voted, and yet there has to be a secure chain of trust around this artifact, which has this weird secrecy and non-secrecy properties, which have to be tabulated and added together and announced to the public in a trustworthy way. And in America, we use the dumbest voting system in the world with this first past the post plurality, which creates R versus Ds that fight each other, but the rest of the world uses other interesting things like ranked choice voting and IRV, and like in Holland I built in the Netherlands I built a formally verified tally system which is used to this day for European elections because they have an interesting list-based scheme. Other places use proportional representation. Other places, so there's all sorts of interesting math. So I was like, okay, this is cool. I'm going to get into this. And what I learned then, and which has only gotten worse over the last 20 years, is the state of voting system security is worse than anything I've even described to you thus far. In the US, we have a handful of vendors. The main ones are listed here. And they're all not very good at what they do. Or more properly, they're excellent at doing what they do because they create stuff that they can sell and their customers buy it. Right? But like most of the systems deployed in the world today that run elections in America were designed in the late 80s and early 90s and were sold in a glut of money when Java came out. In 2003 and 2004, $3 billion were spent on voting machines, and there were no certification standards in practice. So the machines were just bought rapidly from vendors that said, I promise it works right, and we are dealing with it today. Internationally, there's two other vendors, SSITH out of Barcelona and Smartmatic out of who knows where. It's a mystery. I go to WikiLeaks and search for Smartmatic. It's very interesting. And so we've got these vendors that are developing interesting systems, and the average voting system, which I'll show you some pictures of and tell you about, is either a COTS system running Windows or Linux that's unpatched forever, because if you patch it, you have to recertify it, and recertifying it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, or is custom hardware designed and manufactured in the 90s before security was a thing. Here's some flavors of that, for example, and systems that I've looked at is, for example, the system used in Holland up until myself and some colleagues got it canned from a company called NetApp. There's India that has a lot of big countries have their own voting systems they developed as an internal project, and they, like India says, our voting system is the best in the world, it's super secure, and it's very far from that. You have optical mark sense voting systems. This is like your SAT tests back in the 80s, pencils and little holes and you scratch. You have DRM systems where you're voting and there's no paper involved at all. Those are the things that computer scientists don't like. Paper is critical. And then, of course, these days there's people trying to sell things like internet voting systems. I love internet voting. It's like, okay, I'm going to vote. I'm going to authenticate. Okay, give me your $100. Here's a phone. It's like people don't think of the easiest attacks. And then you have new systems that use crypto in novel ways. These are called end-to-end verifiable voting systems, of which there's been several over the years that are academic. And the new thing in that space that's being developed, which I won't talk about today because it's not about secure hardware, is called Election Guard. Election Guard is from Microsoft, and it is a end-to-end verifiable cryptographic system that even these vendors I just showed you can use. And it's meant to dynamically, interestingly change the way we vote in the USA and the world. And my team is creating that with Microsoft. So if you want to learn more about that, Google Election Guard. Here are some of the examples of these systems, and then we'll turn to how secure hardware intersects with this. So some of them are bespoke systems, and as I mentioned, most of these are built in the 80s. So literally they have 8080s inside of them. They have old school 8-bit microcontrollers that you haven't seen in forever that happen to be on a Sound Blaster. They're really simple. They have minimal RAM, minimal store, custom PCBs, no OS at all. It's all bare metal programming. And so oftentimes they'll create these, like this NetApp system here, and they'll say, it's obviously secure. We don't have an operating system, right? It's designed as a voting system. It can only vote. That's the only thing it can ever do. And then one of my graduate students says, ha, 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 yeah, right. And they make it play chess. Literally, that's what happened. So these are easily hacked, right? Easily reverse engineered because they are so simple and they have no security baked into them at all. Here's my friends Rop and Alex and Hari, who hacked the India voting machine. They got kicked out of the country for it. It's a thing. You can go Google it. It's also an 8-bit old school voting system with no security at all. And then we had lever machines. So there's a whole generation of folks. Maybe some of you have voted on a lever machine. These are full mechanical voting machines, like the old electromechanical pinball machines, the really loud ones that are full of gears and levers and the like. So this is a voting machine that uses physical mechanisms in order to capture vote tallies. So there is no paper ballot record. There's no way to audit it. And in fact, if something goes wrong in here, it's very difficult to debug, shall we say, in a modern area. Like literally a mouse can die in there and the voting machine doesn't work anymore. You flip levers on the front to indicate your vote, and then you pull this giant lever, which actuates the entire mechanics inside, makes this wonderful kerchunk sound. And then you voted. And the moment you do that and you let go, the curtain opens. It's all quite a marvelous interaction. And then you have OpScan systems where you fill in the bullets, the bubbles, and this historically was done with no digital techniques were used. You're instead using just a single light sensor, and you're seeing dark versus light areas, and it's lined up with hash marks on the side of your ballot. These days, modern systems are starting to use things like normal scanners. So you turn this into a JPEG image, and then you use digital, normal processing, video processing in order to interpret the marks. Of course, that has this interesting set of challenges given the firmware that's in scanners these days and how the bits that come out of the scanner aren't the bits that you think you sent in there. Here's an example of an OpScan system. This is an old Diebold system. Diebold no longer exists. Most people hear, voting machine and they think Diebold. Diebold tried to rebrand themselves as Sequoia, and then got bought by Smartmatic, that mysterious company I mentioned earlier. And then the government said, okay, Smartmatic, you have to reveal your ownership structure and where your company is. And rather than do so, they sold Sequoia to ES&S. So that's the history of Diebold. And here's an example of using one these days. And then you have DREs sometimes with VVPAT. Here's a Diebold touch screen. This is old school memristor touch screen. You vote, the machine says, I promise I recorded your vote accurately, and then you walk away. But if you plug in a keyboard into the exposed USB port and you hit Alt-Tab, it does what you think it does. Really, really awful security in these guys. And I love this photo with the old person giving us the finger. So this is the state of the art, though. I mean, these are the systems that are now slowly being replaced with the new HAVA money that was just appropriated over the past few months. So these are terribly built. They run Windows for the most part. No paper ballots. They're really awful. You got to be kidding me. This is the stuff that's very easily hacked. And so basically, this is the state of the art. We've personally assessed many of these things. There's no rigor. Certification is sketchy. Poor quality. So how do we make it better? Oh, wait. Of course, people now tout internet voting, and Estonia is voting on the internet, so we all should, and Australia and Switzerland, and blockchain solves everything. You guys know that. Blockchain solves everything. That's not true. There's this nice little XKCD about trying to do computer science with voting, and basically it ends with, they say they fixed it with something called blockchain. Run away. Not a thing. And here's some sample code from Estonia's voting system. This is the function that's called to make sure that a encrypted ballot that was just submitted is in fact a legitimate ballot for the election. Literally. That's the code on GitHub. So, what do we do instead? Here's a picture of Joe. So a few years ago, the community decided to start something called the DEF CON Voting Village to teach the world about these situations and examine these machines. This is from the very first DEF CON where Joe had his photo taken and is now reused over and over in the world, all over the place. And basically, on average, in under 4 hours, every machine is compromised such that an adversary can change the outcome of election. That's how it's worked every year. This last year, I brought this machine. This is an ES&S 650 central count scanner. I had a 17-year-old intern at my company who didn't know any computer science at all, and he said, I want to learn about computer science and reverse engineering. I said, here's a voting system. Here's a book. Go learn, and every time you get stuck, come ask me a question, but I promise I will do no hacking. So by the time he took it to DEF CON, he had reverse engineered the whole thing and hacked it. And people care. All right, here's the Wall Street Journal that week, reporting on my poor student's hack on that particular system. So this is the state of affairs. So what has happened is a miracle, and this is where I conclude. This is where I'm going to encourage you to come to Las Vegas. Election technology is on everybody's minds. It's a piece of nationally critical infrastructure. It's notorious for its security flaws. And strangely enough, a modern voting system needs a microcontroller and a desktop CPU and a superscalar CPU. And many people in the field advocate if we need a new generation of voting systems for nationally critical infrastructure, it should be open source and open hardware and have an assurance case. And due to some miracle, DARPA decided that that was in fact true and they should do something about it. So the demonstrator system for SSITH to show off these secure CPUs, they decided is a voting system. And they hired my company to build it. This is our ballot market, our smart ballot box. That's working in my office right now. Open hardware, open source software. The entire thing runs on this embedded microcontroller. In fact, our mechanism is just an Epson printer that we tore apart and reused pieces of and reverse engineered to make it low cost. All the hardware is open, so that you can get the CAD. Once it goes public in a few weeks, the CAD files are open. The PCB designs we've done are all open, and the entire thing runs a formally assured, like national security formally assured implementation of this voting system. So this is these are the ballots that come out of the voting system when you vote on the touch screen, which is just open source software running on COTS. Got nice usability, accessibility folks involved. Disabled folks can vote with it. Here's our reverse engineered paper feeder, because we didn't want to spend lots of government money on just building a new damn paper feeder. So we just do that. Here's examples of building our rigs, and in particular, the software we've written will run on a normal microcontroller just fine, but when you put it on the secure hardware, it runs even better, shall we say? And then we're also been tasked with building a full open hardware design as well, so that you don't have to go buy either an Epson printer and tear it apart yourself, or a $9,000 FPGA. Instead, what they've tasked me to do is to design a open hardware stack with a low-cost FPGA that should cost under $100, on which you can run a secure microcontroller. And along with that, you can order an actual smart ballot box for under $100. So we've been doing design on that so far. And that's what it looks like in real life, as it were. So that's what we're up to. And the way to demonstrate this all, and how I conclude, is if you're gonna make something that you claim is secure, how do you show that? Now, we've built formal tools that'll let us measure security and et cetera, but the government's not going to let me open source some of those. So we need another means by which to democratize secure hardware. So what DARPA has decided to do, and I have to admit I had a little hand in this decision, is they're publishing all the source, all the firmware, and all the hardware designs all the way down to the RTL. Every design doc, every peer-reviewed paper, every technical report, every assumption about the security of the system, every claim about the system, every proof, make it all available to the public, and then red team it. And when I say red team it, I mean not only do you get to attack it through its interfaces, a serial port and Ethernet, you get to load any malware you want on the device, along with the voting system. And the claim is, even if you're on the inside, and you can write your own malware and load it yourself, the system will still operate properly. It's, as far as I know, the most ambitious, open, end-to-end red team exercise ever done in the history of man. And the first version of it will happen in a few weeks in Las Vegas at DEF CON at the Voting Village. They've funded me to do this for next year too, at 2020, at which time we will have a bigger, more complete voting system that has all three kinds of CPUs in it, which will be running not just FreeRTOS on the microcontroller, but also Linux and FreeBSD, with basically all the same capabilities. So load your own malware that you want onto these more modern operating systems as opposed to just free RTOS. So that is the public demonstration of secure hardware. If you can affect a software attack through that stack, even given the fact that you can put your own malware on the device and you can show a vulnerability, then you have defeated the secure hardware. That's the core idea here. And it's not just happening at DEF CON. This red team exercise starts at DEF CON and runs continuously henceforth. Some of these systems will be on the internet and you can literally attack them and load malware over the internet on the device to try to show the secure hardware is not secure. So, for more information, that's where you can find us. We're Galois and Free and Fair in Portland. RISC-V, you can find out about it from the RISC-V Foundation. Announcements about this project go out on our Twitter feeds. And I promise there's no malware in the QR code. And thanks for your attention. I'll take questions. You coming to DEF CON, Joe?
So threat model
yes.
is access through the serial console and Ethernet port.
And a facilitated mechanism by which to load your own malware. And that's over Ethernet.
That means it's over Ethernet.
It's over Ethernet.
No physical access to any of it.
No physical access. So this particular program is not about physical hardware attacks, because that would be trivial on an FPGA in particular. It's only about software-enabled vulnerabilities. There are other programs working on that. And if this turns out well, then I would imagine there's going to be hardware coming to hardware conferences wherein you can do what you do more. Yeah? Okay. Nobody asked me where Shield was being used. Those little dilets. Yes?
Is that about the size of a grain of rice?
It's much smaller. You're very funny. Shield is not being used in the hardware. DARPA said, we're looking for interesting ways to use the smallest IC in the world ever. Why don't we give you a bunch and you put it in the paper ballots? So imagine having a piece of paper that is capable of performing crypto and detecting tampering. Put it in the pulp. It's so small you can just put it in the pulp. That's what they've tasked me with doing. And I was like, when they said that to me, and then I went and thought about it and figured out ways that it could actually possibly work. And so we will demonstrate crypto paper this year, not in the voting system, just a little separate demo because it's really freaking hard. And then in 2020, I'm going to show how this might work. And they're playing with other ideas, like, imagine your $100 bill had crypto in it, that kind of thing. Question? Yes? Question?
I was just going to be the person who asked weird things.
Right on. All right.
Where can I get a couple of them?
Which ones? The dilets?
Dilets, yeah. Where do I get my SDK for that one?
Yeah. No, that's a sensitive topic. They are being used by some companies now. So there's licensing going on out of SRI in particular. So I know somebody has started down a path of, as dumb as it is, something about a hardware wallet with dilets, dumb shit like that. You're not going to see them broadly available anytime soon. But I will have a few hundred of them at DEF CON. And I think they're going to make me keep them all, but we'll see. In volume, they're only supposed to cost 1/10 of a penny each, if you have any concerns around costs. You can put a lot of them on one wafer, but it's really tough to cut them, shall we say. Yes, Joe? On these particular systems?
They're on the other sheet, like if you have a stack of paper ballots.
Yes. That would be a thing that they're interested in and not my area of expertise.
Okay.
Yeah. I would imagine that you could blow them all with one well-tuned frequency, though, because you're going to be manipulating the MEMS. Yeah. All right. Thanks for your questions and interest. I appreciate it.